When I was a sophomore in college, it was Christmas break. I was at Freed-Hardeman University, and it was Christmas break, so I was up home in Ohio, and as I was there, I was planning a trip to come back down about a week early so that I could go down to Alabama to visit my friend. And as I was coming down to Ohio, I stopped in Cincinnati, and then I was going to pass on through Kentucky. Well, I stopped at Cincinnati, and I stopped at a Taco Bell there. And as I was there, everything seemed normal, and I paid for my food, and then I left. And then I traveled about 3 more hours, and I found myself in Franklin, Kentucky. And my gas said I only had about 70 more miles to go. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm about an hour outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I'll go ahead and stop here in Franklin and get some gas. Well, just like normal, I get out to go get my gas, and I realized I could not find my wallet. And I was completely terrified. I was starting to think, where could my wallet be? I had all of my college things and all my travel things packed into my car. And so I started tearing apart my car and looking for my wallet. And I'm thinking, okay, how in the world am I going to make it to where I need to go, which I was going down to Alabama on 70 miles of gas. I knew I couldn't do it. I even had crazy thoughts about maybe getting my guitar out of my car and trying to play it to try to make some money to get some gas. I didn't know what I needed to do. And so then, as the story ended, I ended up calling my friend in Nashville. I had just enough gas to get to the north part of Nashville. And my friend met me, and he was able to get me a tank of gas, and I was able to pay him back later on. But through that whole experience, I realized the pain of losing something and the aggravation of not being able to find something. It turns out I had left my wallet up there at the Taco Bell back in Cincinnati, Ohio, almost 5 hours away from Nashville. I did some calling. I tried to look for it for the next 2 weeks, calling Taco Bells around that area because I couldn't really pinpoint exactly what part of Cincinnati I was in, and it was just a mess. And maybe you have experienced that same aggravation at times. Maybe you also have lost something, and you've searched for it, and you can't find it. And if so, then you know the exact same aggravation that I'm talking about. The past couple of weeks, we've studied about joy. In fact, I did a lesson a couple of weeks ago on joy. The brother from last week talked about joy as well. And in a time like this, it would be very easy for us to lose our joy. We're unable to be together with our church family. Some of you have lost your work jobs for now. Or you don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future with your job. Some of you are struggling because you have all the kids at home and life's just crazy and it's hard to find joy when everything's so crazy at home. Some of you maybe are struggling financially because of this situation. Maybe some of you are struggling to even put food on the table. And then all of us are missing being together with the church family and being together to worship and to encourage one another. It'd be very easy for us in this time to lose our joy. Maybe there's other things in your life outside of the current situation that maybe you've lost your joy for quite a while. And if that's the case this morning, I hope to encourage you as we're going to be talking about finding joy in fellowship, even when we're apart. Here on the screen, I have a picture of Finding Nemo. And if you I've seen that movie. I'm sure many parents have seen it over and over again. It's a movie about this clownfish. His son Nemo is lost. And so the entire movie is the father and Dory here searching for Nemo. And they search frantically. They go all over the ocean, even find themselves on land at times in order to find this clownfish's son, Nemo. And maybe for you, your search for joy has been similar to that. Maybe for you, it's been a struggle. You've searched for it. You've tried to find it, and you haven't found it. Maybe this was a struggle for you before all this current situation has been going on. And maybe for many of us now who are used to being together to encourage one another, maybe now we are struggling to have that same joy. And so this morning, as we're going to be looking at Philippians, and as we open up, and we're going to be doing this for about 8 weeks, counting this week. And when we look at Philippians, typically I would tell you that the key word of Philippians is joy. And in fact, if I hadn't have studied that much for this lesson, that's what I would have told you today. Yet, as I read through Philippians several times in preparation for this lesson, and as I studied the various books that I referenced in this, I realized that the point of Philippians, the driving force of Philippians, is actually not really joy. Instead, it's about the gospel. It's about the furtherance of the gospel, the advancement of the gospel. And then another key word of Philippians, so the gospel is the first key word. The second key word, if you were to look at how many times it's mentioned, is fellowship. It's also probably in your translation as partnership or to share, friendship, co-working together. All right, is the idea of fellowship. And then the third word, which brings it all together, then is the word joy. And so here's what I think we can take from Philippians, and really going to be our point today. Today we're just going to seek to kind of do a little bit of an overview, but we're mainly going to focus on this point here, is that we have joy because our fellowship is with Christ and with the church, which is rooted in the mission of the gospel. And here's what I mean by that. Because we understand fellowship good enough, I think, is that we are like-minded with another person, and because of our like-mindedness, because of our sameness, because of what we have in common, we're able to have a relationship with one another. Except for in this instance, what we have in common is to be rooted in the gospel. We may have similar hobbies. We may have similar things that we like. But what it's supposed to be rooted in is our common faith and our common salvation that we have through Jesus Christ. And it's through the common mission that we have to redeem, or to seek and to save lost souls. And so the point this morning is for us is that even when we are separated, we find joy in our partnership in the mission of the gospel. And here's how this is spoken from Philippians. If you look at the letter of Philippians, you can go back to Acts chapter 16, and you can see that Paul comes to the city of Philippi, which is in Macedonia. In fact, the city is named after Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. And so he comes to Philippi, and he meets a lady named Lydia. And through study and through evangelism, she's converted, her and her entire household. And then, if you look towards the end of the chapter, you find Paul actually in prison. And as he's there in prison, he's able to, through a series of events that I won't go into today, is able to convert the jailer of that particular prison, and is able to convert his entire household. This is the planting of the church in Philippi. And so about 10 years later, Paul writes to that church. This church has grown a lot in 10 years, as you can imagine the amount of growth that happens in 10 years. Paul has again found himself in prison as he writes this letter to the church at Philippi. And you think about just how coincidental or maybe ironic that would be for the fact that he established the church when he was in prison, and then through that experience and through the continuing, he continues to advance the gospel and continues to proclaim the gospel, finds himself in a similar situation as he writes to them again. But what we can learn from that is that as Paul writes this letter, is that he does not allow distance to separate himself from his brothers and sisters in Christ. Is that although Paul is separated, because most likely he's in prison in Rome and they are in Philippi, although they are separated, they still share the common partnership in the mission of the gospel. And Philippians is all about Paul writing how even though he's in prison, he continues to advance the gospel. And how they continue to have fellowship with one another, even though they have distance between us. If you would, we're kind of going to jump around a little bit just in Philippians today. But we're going to start in Philippians chapter 1. And I want to first see this principle expressed here. We're just going to start at verse 1 and read through verse 11. And then we're going to hone in on a couple verses here. So why don't you join me in reading Philippians 1 through 11, looking for this very same principle, is that even though we are separated, we find joy in our partnership in the mission of the gospel. It says, Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Jesus Christ who are at Philippi, with the overseers and the deacons. Grace to you and peace from our God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to feel this way about you, because I hold you in my heart, for you all are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve what is excellent, and that you may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. And so Paul writes out this paragraph where he's just telling them, listen, I'm away from you, but I pray for you every day. I constantly remember you in my prayers, and I'm sure some of us can relate to that right now. As we miss our brethren, we're just praying for them, we're praying for the church daily. And we're going to focus on this paragraph next week in our lesson as we talk about finding joy through prayer. But today, I just want to focus on two or three verses as we find them in this paragraph. First, let's look back just verses 3 through 5. Paul says, I thank my God in my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you, all making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. What I want us to see there is Paul says, I pray for you often. Every time I say a prayer, I mention the church of Philippi. I mention each one of you. And he emphasizes that as he says, I pray for you all. That you there is plural. So that's like him saying, I pray for all y'all, if we would say it in Southern English. And he's saying, I pray for each and every one of you on a daily basis, every time I say a prayer. And when you look down, and he says, and this is a joy for me. Oh, Paul, why is it a joy to pray for your brethren, even when you're not with them? And this is what he says, verse 5. Because of your partnership. That's the same word for fellowship. Koinonia is the word. It's the same word for fellowship, for sharing. It's the same word when we say we have fellowship one another. This is the word. It's because of your partnership in what? That we have common interests? That we have common hobbies? That we play the same sports? No, he says, in the gospel from the first day into now. And so what Paul is saying is that even though I'm separated from you, I'm able to find joy in our fellowship because of our partnership, our common interest in spreading the gospel to the lost, carrying out the work of God on earth is what they had a joint effort in doing. And then you look over at verse 7. He says, and it is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart. I hold you close to me, he says. For you are all partakers of me, with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in defense and confirmation of the gospel. He says, even as I'm separated from you, you're working with me. As I'm in prison, I feel your prayers with me. I feel the work that you are doing for the sake of the gospel. He says, and that encourages me. And so what Paul says, let me emphasize it again. He says, even though we are separated, we find joy in our partnership in the mission of the gospel. And here today, you and I find ourselves in a place where we cannot be together. We find ourselves in a very similar place that Paul was with the church at Philippi, is that he couldn't be with them, yet he was still encouraged by their fellowship and in their joint mission of spreading the gospel. You and I are unable to be in the same room because of this virus, but that does not stop us from having fellowship. And listen to me closely so you don't confuse what I say here, because I don't want to be confused on this. But our fellowship is not contingent on the external aspects of fellowship. And here's what I mean by that, is our fellowship is not contingent on how many fellowship meals we can have together. It's not even contingent on how many Bible classes we have together, or whether or not we worship together on Sunday, although those things are good and we're supposed to be doing those things every week. But our fellowship is rooted in the fact that we have entrusted ourselves to a God who died on the cross for our sins, redeemed us, and now we are to spread that message to all the lost souls of the earth. That is where our fellowship lies. And I also want to emphasize here, as Paul found himself in prison, but he continues to talk about the advancement of the gospel, spreading the good news, is even though he was in prison, his mission did not get paused. And I think this is so important for us to see, is that although we cannot be together right now, and although we may not be able to go door knocking to evangelize, or although we may not be able to invite someone to a physical building to be with us, is although those things are true, is our mission, the thing that unites us in fellowship, is not on pause. The work of God can never be paused. Because whether or not we're able to meet in our regular building, there are still lost souls in the world today. There are still people that, although the rest of the world has put pause, there are still people who are lost outside of Christ and who need us. Now, when you look on the news on a daily basis, you're given some very scary and some very worrisome statistics at times, and the media puts that stuff out there. And even if you were to look on the news, and I often say this, even if you were to look on the news, not during this time when this virus wasn't going on, you're oftentimes going to be given different statistics and different discouragements and different things. I remember watching I don't watch the news very often, but I remember turning it on one time, and in a matter of 5 minutes, I learned I was going to die from cancer because I eat bananas and because I have coffee and because I take warm showers. And what I realized is, okay, there's a lot of bad news out there. But what if we hear all those statistics that scare us at times, but what if on a daily basis, whether in this time or whether not in this time, we were to be given the statistics of those who are living and dying outside of Christ? How much of an impact would that make on us? And so although life in a real way in the world right now has taken a pause, we cannot allow the mission of God to pause. We cannot pause in our evangelistic work. We cannot take a pause in our loving our neighbor. We cannot take a pause in seeking to advance the gospel. Paul didn't take a pause when he was imprisoned. And we cannot take a pause now as our nation is combating this virus. So let's continue to look at Philippians chapter 2. That's supposed to say 2 there, so excuse me there. But look with me at Philippians chapter 2. We'll pick up at verse 19. So we've seen this principle expressed in Philippians, and really we're going to see it all throughout our series, is that although we are apart, we can continue to have fellowship through our relationship with God and through our joint mission together. But here, towards the end of chapter 2, we are given 2 examples of this principle. The first example is Timothy. He's raised up as an example. Look with me starting at verse 19, and we'll read through verse 24. It says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. So I want to highlight a couple verses here. Number 1, in verse 20, it says of Timothy, Paul says, for I have no one like him who is genuinely concerned for your welfare. He's genuinely concerned for welfare. And if you look at verse 21, he says this, for all other people, they seek their own interest. But Timothy, although he is separated from you, continues to seek your welfare. And then notice in verse 22, it says, and Paul highlights his own personal relationship with Timothy. He says, but you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. And there we're given an example about how close we can be with one another through our fellowship in the advancement and spreading of the gospel. So through Timothy, we learn two things, is that although we're separated, we should still be genuinely concerned for other people, not just ourselves in this time. We still need to be checking up on all those in the church and making sure they have adequate supplies. We need to be checking up on one another because there's other health issues during this time that are still going on as well, that many from our church family are suffering from. And people need encouragement. We need to be genuinely concerned about one another in this time. And then that second part is we realize even from a point of separation, we can still grow so close to have those spiritual family ties that Paul did with Timothy. Now look with me, and this is our last passage we're going to read today, at Epaphroditus in the next paragraph here. And he's the second example of this principle lived out. Look with me at verses 25, and this is Philippians 2, I apologize, Philippians 2, 25 through 30. It says, I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need, for he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you have heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow, and I am even more eager to send him to me. And then the next two verses, I'll go ahead and paraphrase those. It says, because he has risked his life for the sake of the advancement of the gospel. And so Epaphroditus, that's not someone we typically study, but who that was, he was a person from the church at Philippi, and Epaphroditus had sent a gift from the church of Philippi to Paul while he was in prison. This was a financial gift to help him in his needs. And there's parts of the letter where Paul, especially in chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, where Paul extensively thanks them for the gift that Epaphroditus had sent them. But through doing that and through working with Paul there in Rome, Epaphroditus apparently got ill in some way, and his life was risked. And so here's a couple lessons we can learn from Epaphroditus. First, in chapter 25, I want you to notice the descriptions of Epaphroditus are all about fellowship and are all about this common goal of spreading the gospel. Here it says that he's a brother, he's a fellow worker, he's a fellow soldier, he's a messenger, he's a minister, right? And so what we need to realize is our church family are not just people we're stuck in the room with, or in this case, people who we're all in a Facebook group with. We're fellow workers. We're fellow soldiers in the battlefield. We're working toward the common goal of saving lost souls. And then notice in the last part of that paragraph we read that Epaphroditus had risked his life for the sake of the gospel. Helping people during this time could risk your life. Seeking to do the will of God in this time could cause some discomfort to us. But Epaphroditus is an example where he put others' needs above himself, and he put the spreading of the gospel above himself. And I pray that we all can do that as well. And so here's how we can wrap up and draw some conclusions here, is that even though we are separated, we must find joy in our partnership in the mission of the gospel. Is we are blessed in a time right now of technological advancement. Imagine if this were to happen 3 years ago, or even 5 years ago. We would not be able to do what we are doing this morning because the technology just wasn't there. It wasn't on everybody's phones like it is now to just make a live video. So in that sense, we're blessed. There's a lot of ways for us to communicate that if this were to even happen 5 years ago, we would be unable to do. And we need to take advantage of that. And then we must realize that our mission, as we have said, is not put on hold. Is there still people dying outside of Christ today? And we need to be spreading that message. And so we might ask, how can we work together to advance the gospel during this season of life when we're unable to go out? We're unable to do the things that we normally would do. I have a couple suggestions here. Number one, we need to learn to evangelize through social media. Brandon's working on getting our public Facebook page together where we'll be able to share these live videos on the public page so anybody can join. And I was teaching at Mableville on Wednesday night on our public page, and someone from England joined us and commented on the video, and I was able to have a conversation with them and to pray for them and some needs that they had. We can post encouraging posts. We can message those who we think might be hurting who are outside of Christ. We can post scriptures each day to give people encouragement. We can spread hope. And then number 2 is that we can possibly, if you have the ability, we can help produce masks and help produce supplies that are needed in order to give those to medical officials, or to give those who are older in our congregation, or older neighbors that you might have that might be in some need of that. Number 3, we can give to those who maybe are financially hurting, or maybe some families who are struggling with the kids home to put food on the table. Maybe they've lost their jobs and are unable to do so. We can help in that way as well. And the number 4, my 4th application here, is that we can invite members to join this online feed. Is although we don't have a building to meet in to invite people, we can invite them to join this feed, which I already know many of you have been doing, and what a blessing that is for us to do that. I thank you for being here this morning, and I hope you've been encouraged, is that even though we are separated, we find joy in our partnership in the mission of the gospel. Don't be discouraged. God is doing wonderful things through the church. He's doing wonderful things through the Enola Church as well, and He's doing wonderful things through each one of us as individuals, if we will accept His will for our life and do that.